Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're very delighted to be inaugurating a new Transatlantic Dialogue series. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Global Europe program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. For today, I want to particularly add my other title, which is the Austrian Marshall Plan Distinguished Fellow, because it's symbolic of the strong cooperation we have with our partner, the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, whose director, Markus Schweiger, is here. And I want to thank Markus and their president, Wolfgang Petrich, and their board for continuing partnership with us. We're starting this as a series throughout the year in which we'll bring prominent European and American speakers together to discuss pressing issues. I can't think of a more pressing issue than the topic we have right now, which is how do we beat COVID-19? What's the assessment of how well we've done sort of 1 year out? And what has been the transatlantic piece to this, the cooperation that we've had? So since we're inaugurating this today, I can't be even more delighted that we have with us the ambassador of Austria to the United States, Martin Weiss, and the chargé of the US Embassy in Austria, Robin Dunnigan, with us, and I ask each of them just to briefly give us some welcoming remarks. Ambassador Weiss, maybe I should turn first to you.
Thank you, Dan. Well, it's great to be with you today. We are looking back at many good cooperations with you. I think back of the Austrian lecture series. So we are really proud to be partner of this cooperation, and with partners like the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, the US Embassy in Vienna. How can we possibly go wrong? Great to be with you. As you said, in this day and age, there can probably only be one topic to open this series. The COVID pandemic has pretty much kept us all busy for 1 year. Now there seems to be somewhat a light at the end of this tunnel. I just saw the latest numbers for the US economy, a growth of 6% predicted for this year. Overtaking Chinese growth numbers, which is amazing. So there really is some end at the light of this tunnel. We take it a bit slower in Europe, but slowly but steadily, we all will be getting there. Transatlantic cooperation sometimes is a bit of an anemic slogan, but really we know how strong it makes us both. The partners on both sides of the Atlantic are so much the stronger for a close cooperation. And COVID is only one example. Other examples will follow in this series. Great to be here. Very much looking forward to this panel. And of course, very proud of such high expertise made in Austria, in Eva Schernhammer and Florian Kramer. So really looking forward to today. Thanks for having me and good luck for the whole series.
Thank you, Martin. Robin, please.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here to welcome everyone together with Ambassador Weiss, who I think is one of the hardest working ambassadors in Washington, probably. But also thank you to the Wilson Center and the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation and our panelists. It's a great time to be talking about this. I think most of you have been following the news and you know that President Biden, Vice President Harris, Secretary Blinken came into office and said that their #1 priority was to beat this pandemic. And they also made one other thing abundantly clear, and that's that cooperation and coordination with our partners and allies around the world was essential to doing that. And they backed it up with some actions. The first thing they did was rejoin the World Health Organization, re-engage with the World Health Organization. We've also committed to providing $2 billion to COVAX, with another $2 billion committed. So I think that we are really seeing that our a commitment on the part of the U.S. government to this transatlantic cooperation. And I think that on a granular level, at least from where I sit in Vienna, our transatlantic ties in this field are stronger and broader than people know. Here at the embassy, we have approved and facilitated hundreds of travel visas for travel over this past year of researchers, academics, scientists, public health officials to go to the United States and work with their counterparts to beat COVID. So I think we can all see a little light at the end of the tunnel right now, as Martin said, and the real stories, the real heroes of this story are the scientists and the healthcare workers and the researchers and the academics. So I'm very much looking forward to our distinguished group of panelists today to hear more what we can and should be doing when it comes to transatlantic cooperation in this area. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much. Well, we're going to turn to those heroes today, and we're going to turn to their insights and the people who have been really working on this to understand their assessment of where we are and where we've been. We have audience participation, so I'm asking each of the speakers to start us off with some brief comments, but you can give us your questions and answers, comment yourself if you'd like. You can do that by sending us an email at GEP, so Global Europe Program, GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. So if you'd like to participate, I'll review that later again, but GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. So let's turn to our speakers and our panelists. We have sent around the invitation. You have something of their backgrounds, but just to again repeat, we're so delighted Dr. Eva Schernhammer is here as professor of epidemiology at the Medical University of Vienna and also Harvard Medical School. Florian Kramer, who's a Mount Sinai professor of vaccinology at Icahn School of Medicine, and Jeffrey Kaplan, who's vice president for global health at Emory University and former head of the US CDC. Eva, if I could start with you, give us your view on how well this has happened, what it's been like to have to struggle against this pandemic, and in your insights of where you think we are today, please.
Yeah, thank you. Let me also add that I very much look forward to the discussion that is going to come forward, especially with my colleague Florian Kramer on the other side of the Atlantic, essentially presenting that view on top of the Austrian perspective. I thought I will start off with a bit of a comparison between Europe and the United States. And to me, this is very relevant because I am a dual citizen of both countries. I love both countries, perhaps a tad more leaning towards the United States because I have spent a lot of time there. And so for me, both I have watched very carefully during this pandemic. As an epidemiologist, I have learned a lot. This is real life learning, and it was an interesting experience thus far. We are still in the middle of it here in Europe. And just to put this into this context, we now have over 120 million infected cases globally. And it's interesting because the emergence of this disease has been somewhat different between the two continents, and yet if you look at the bottom line, there were 29 million cases thus far with COVID-19 infection in the United States and 23 million in Europe. We have 538,000 deaths in the United States today, and we have 562,000 deaths in Europe today. So interestingly, it is quite comparable what has happened on both continents, with though very different approaches in some ways. As you probably know, in Europe, everything has started earlier than in the United States, perhaps by 1 month. And so, or maybe 2 months in that range. So we had our first occurrences and clusters in Italy, then very quickly in Austria, which was very much at the center of the pandemic, and then throughout Europe, and then was also putting foot into the United States at around the same time. But many of the early developments in Europe were basically followed maybe 4, 6, 8 weeks afterwards in the United States. And to me, what was interesting is at this early stage of the pandemic, there was actually, from my perspective, very little of learning from each other. Often I was watching American news and thinking, oh, but we could tell you how this will go because we just went through it right now. And yet there was not much that was sort of looked across the Atlantic at that point. But then I think slowly we were getting a hold of the fact that we need each other really to learn from each other. And so already soon after, it was obvious that, for instance, my colleagues at Harvard School of Public Health, who with Michael Mina and Mark Lipsitch were really leading the field in testing strategies, that they were leading the way also for Europe, where we now in Austria have really sophisticated testing strategy that allows us to some extent to have our schools and businesses open, even though we are essentially in a third wave of the pandemic right now. So the testing is something that we have learned from the United States. And it was very instrumental to have these connections between the two continents among the scientists who know each other and exchange each other. And then, of course, the vaccine development, such a close collaboration in so many facets. And I'm sure Florian will tell us much more about that soon, between the continents, where really the central figures are from both continents in most cases. And so I think it was a remarkable course of events over the past months in both continents, parallel and yet politically quite different. So from a scientific perspective, I would say that we are on par with each other very much. We collaborate a lot, and even more than in the past. Politically, each continent has taken different approaches by ways also of the political systems, probably. And so this is not my expertise, but I think it's interesting from my point of perspective that the bottom line today is so comparable, even though quite different political approaches have been taken, and perhaps we can discuss this later. But what I take away, and this I will close my opening remarks here, is that for a scientific enterprise and for us scientists, we have really accelerated Europe, where I would say, since I know both systems quite well, that in terms of digitalization, we were perhaps a little bit behind on the common day sort of approach compared to the United States, and have now, due to the pandemic, had an acceleration in learning how to use these online tools like this here, and having really had a new opening to collaborate internationally, in my view, most importantly with the United States. Because the ties have always been close already before the pandemic, and now with these digital tools, we have really profoundly accelerated that collaboration. And for me, what was interesting and new is it has not only allowed me to collaborate with medical colleagues or public health colleagues, but also in a transdisciplinary fashion. We have all of a sudden dealt with a topic like COVID-19 that spanned across various disciplines, and it has enabled new transdisciplinary collaborations I have never seen before, and I find highly stimulating, leading to topics like One Health. We live on one planet. We need to deal with the fact that there will be animals, and if we infringe their habitat, it will have a reverse impact on us. So many interesting topics that are emerging because of this transdisciplinary collaboration that I find extremely helpful. And I think it's going to change the world for the better if we keep up what we are doing now. And I really hope that's going to be the case. And I will stop here for now.
Thank you so much. Florian, I wonder from your perspective whether you share Eva's general optimism in a way, despite all the challenges we've had about how we go forward, and whether this is a momentous learning experience for us all, or whether you've had other experiences.
Yes, I do share Eva's optimism in terms of what we do in science. I'm a little bit more pessimistic about what society as a whole will learn from this and how we will prepare in the future. But there are 3 points that I wanted to make. The first one is actually echoing what Eva just said. We have seen unprecedented collaboration among scientists, free data sharing, free sharing of reagents. And this is not just transatlantic, that's really globally. And just to give you an example, on January 10th, a Chinese scientist from Fudan University called Zhang Yongchen sent a sequence to another scientist in Australia, who then uploaded the sequence of SARS coronavirus 2 on his blog. That was downloaded on the same day by the Vaccine Research Center at NIH, and Kismekia Corbett designed a vaccine that then became the Moderna vaccine and went into clinical trials basically 2.5 months later. And so these are really, this is an unprecedented way of sharing things, of doing science and again, this is not only transatlantic, this is globally. There was so much data made available early on. on all continents, and I think that really helped us to quickly understand the disease, quickly develop vaccines, and quickly develop countermeasures. And I hope that this will continue. And we have seen this also in vaccine development. Vaccine trials, phase 3 trials have been taking place globally. One of the reasons why we now know so much about these variants and how well vaccines work against variants is because vaccine companies and researchers decided that you have to have these trials also in places like South Africa or Brazil. So we're learning a lot. It's really a global enterprise. That's really the positive point. The negative point that I see a little bit is how this all developed. And it became very clear to scientists early on that this is not a good development. This is not a good virus. This outbreak is dangerous. But in my opinion, both the US and Europe responded in a very arrogant way to this. It initially was seen as a Chinese problem. And only when the big outbreaks in Italy happened, the big outbreaks in New York, in Seattle happened, was this really taken seriously. I think everybody looked back at the SARS coronavirus outbreaks in 2003 and thought, yeah, we're going to manage this here. Our healthcare system is great. Our science is great. This is not going to be a problem. And this was really a huge mistake that was made. And then there's, of course, many parallels and many differences how Europe and the US managed the pandemic. And I think in the beginning, Europe did much better and went into the summer with a very low prevalence, but that also led to a lot of people thinking that the virus is not that dangerous, and that might have contributed to stronger waves in fall and now in winter in Europe. In the US, it's a little bit harder to generalize because it was a state-by-state response, because at that point, leadership on the national level was actually lacking. And so I think it's very interesting to see how this developed. One big difference is in terms of vaccines. I think the idea in the US was to go big, and that pays off now. And in Europe, this was a little bit more like, yeah, let's buy a little bit, maybe not all of the vaccines that are offered to us. And that comes now back as a mistake and might actually have a negative impact on how the pandemic develops in Europe. And so my last point really is, what are we doing in the future? And I think we really need to strengthen how we investigate viruses like this globally. We need a framework of how to respond to a pandemic, how to prepare for a pandemic. How can we have vaccines much quicker, not just after a year or 14 months, but really after a few months? And I think this is something that is a global enterprise, but Europe and the US already took the lead with that, with CEPI, for example. And I think Europe and the US should have a leading role in this, but we really need to make an effort to prevent these issues in the future. And we know that these viruses will keep coming. We had 4 flu pandemics in the last 100 years. Now we have this one, and there will be another one, that is for sure. The question is just how severe is it going to be, and can we avoid having 2.5 million deaths?
Thank you. And I would add, how do you convey to the public what needs to be done and the seriousness of these types of things? So the public messaging seems to have been a major part of this whole story, also by country in Europe and by state here, and certainly at the federal level. Jeff, how do you think about this now, 1 year out, of how we've done and where we're going to go? Yeah, you're on mute, Jeff. Sorry.
In my excitement to speak, I've left mute on. Sorry. Thanks, Dan. Yes, it's 1 year of the pandemic, but it's 100+ years of worrying about a pandemic. So that for most folks in public health, if you asked what is your biggest worry, and this is 18 months ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 50 years ago, it would be a pandemic coming and striking us again. Often that took the form of, as Florian says, we're going to see other things in the future, But in terms of what were people worried about, it was largely flu, influenza, and variations of influenza, because that was our past experience, at least historically, in the 1918-1919 pandemic. Now our eyes are open and we'll be looking at all kinds of possibilities beyond coronaviruses, but coronaviruses are a good candidate for being the bad guy for years to come. Excellent points made by Florian and Eva, and I won't add to that sense of breakthroughs while also viewing failures or challenges in getting elements of a program like this through. It's an extraordinarily complex process with many players involved who normally don't work together, whether it is the transport system, the education system. It truly is a pandemic in that every country in the world is either affected or has to worry about becoming infected in the course of, even if they've been had a great run up to now. So if you want to use sports metaphors, we're not at the end of the game. You may see the scoreboard saying the light at the end of the tunnel. You may look ahead and say, there's something out there that looks good again, but there's a lot of people with flashlights running around in the tunnel too, diverting us from what might get done. Just a couple of quick comments on elements of this, because I'm sure our participants in the audience and on the screen are well familiar. The amount of attention that global health, public health, vaccines, et cetera, are getting, I think it's going to be a boom time for Mount Sinai and for Harvard Chan School of Public Health and schools around the world. A lot of people are going to want to be epidemiologists after this is over. And a lot of people think they're epidemiologists now as well. A couple of quick points on elements of this. One, the background, at least in the US, it's not a background devoid of misinterpretation and distortion. We have lost ground in our public recognition and valuing of science. Beyond the lack of valuing science, not by everyone obviously, but a sizable enough group of people, at least in the US, to be troublesome and destructive of what we're trying to accomplish. Beyond the denigration of science, there is also accompanying it a distrust of scientific institutions. And it doesn't apply just to the US. It applied earlier in our almost removal from the World Health Organization, which I think would have been a disaster, and now bring them together again. But the kind of lack of trust in these institutions plays a role in this as well. And then finally, a lack of respect for the people doing the work, the scientists. Again, not everyone, but enough to impair some of the things getting done that we want to accomplish. The vaccine is a huge plus, major accomplishment, something that's clearly transoceanic. The vaccines themselves involve the work and the intelligence and the findings and the ability to work together in a, not just a friendly and congenial way, but as has been mentioned, an enhancement of the way we normally do business. We get more out of when we pull a group together than when it's done individually, whether it's by country or by school or whatever. And we've seen, I think, good teamwork over and over again in this outbreak. But often in our rush to the vaccine, less attention, at least in some countries, including the US, has been paid to mitigation and the things that have to get done, whether there's a good vaccine or not a good vaccine. Yes, face masks, distancing, hygiene, etc., can't go away and may not go away even as we step out into the sunshine at the end of the tunnel. These may change the way we relate to each other and need to react. So that shouldn't be off the page. we've got a new respect for data. At least some of us have a new respect for data. What it is, how we measure things, and how that information and data help direct the program. You can't just do a control program without having information that you then react to and fine tune what you're going to do. And we see that on a daily basis in our newspapers, how they report them, hospitalizations, intensive care unit admissions, number of people on a respirator, where the case is occurring, what the genetic makeup is of those cases. There's a lot of information out there, and that information is vital for us accomplishing the task at hand. To that point again, yes, the vaccine is a fabulous advance, and we're glad we have it. But the vaccine does no good unless it's in someone's arm, or deltoid if you want to be specific. And that's called vaccination. So you don't get anywhere without the vaccination part of this thing. And so that in turn needs to pair up with mitigation, so you don't have just a one-way approach to this, but that you have multiple things working together to suppress an ongoing pandemic. And it's that interdependence, whether it's in academic institutions, in governments, in sharing information. Journals have played a key role. Basically, many of the journals have just tossed away their old model completely and have devoted themselves in a targeted, proper manner to the pandemic itself, and article after article. In international journals, again, a quick way to share, and often they're being presented in an electronic format, so you get it without delay and can use it. So all of these things are going to continue with different emphasis on each. A concern I've got is we've got good vaccines, but we also have variants, and how are those going to interplay with the good vaccines? We've got good vaccines, but some people feel this is an excuse to put it bluntly, to behave poorly in the face of the outbreak. And that includes government officials and people in leadership roles who are playing the epidemiologist role, and I think should stick to governance. So that these are things that the future for us is an immediate future, getting this pandemic really under control, recognizing it's probably not going to go away completely in the world, and there will have to be continued attention and assistance to countries that don't have all the resources as those of us on this particular meeting, so that the low and middle income countries are part and parcel of the landscape for all of us. And low and middle income countries will do things in an innovative and thoughtful manner, and there's things to be learned from them. So it's a two-way street, and we need to pay attention to that and treat with respect those that we both want to help and want our help, and things that they can do that enhance what we do. This will continue for not just months, but years to come. How do we travel? How do we outfit ourselves? How do we think about vaccines and vaccination policies? How does a government that's a federation of states or provinces or districts pull together in times like this and not pull apart and turn scientific issues into political issues? That's most unfortunate, and I hope we see less and less of that. So this is it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this discussion, and I look forward to questions and answers if people have them for the state we're in.
Thank you so much. Let me remind our audience again, you can join the conversation here by sending an email to gep@wilsoncenter.org or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. We do have some questions coming in. I'm trying to bundle them. First, maybe we can come back to the science. A number of questions about that. Let me just read one because it's specific as someone's asking for information. This person writes, the SARS-CoV-2 virus seems to operate in two phases. First, there is infection that takes some time to become infectious. And then there's a phase where the virus is no longer viable, but extremely immunogenic, overwhelming the immune system so that this triggers an inflammatory phase. Thus, antivirals are most useful in the first phase and anti-inflammatories are useful in the second. Have the supposed vaccines proven to promote an immune block of viral infection and or infectiousness, or do they only somehow impede the cytokines cascade of the second? If so, how do they really do that? How can they be called vaccines if they don't do that? So that's very specific. Add a couple questions and come back to the three of you. You can pick and choose instead of having to think you have to answer everything at once. There's a question about how we go forward. And am I wrong to say that there's not a post-COVID world, that despite vaccine, that COVID-19 will be endemic and it's something we'll have to live with? Is that sort of a way we should think about this? How to sort of get it under control so it's simply with us, but we can live with it? Or are we? There's so much writing about a post-COVID world. It seems to me maybe not quite right. And then there's the whole question of biology and the revolutions that are happening. You've touched on that. I've been a faculty member at Johns Hopkins for 20 years as well, and my doctor colleagues, the way they sum it up is, in the 20th century, the revolutionary science was physics, but in the 21st century, the revolutionary science is biology. And that some of the things happening with COVID that we've seen, like this new technology through BioNTech, Pfizer, was a different type of approach, as I understand it. Florian mentioned rapid reaction capacity going forward, that we could generate antidotes maybe as quickly as viruses appear. And Eva mentioned this other broader concept of One Health. Eva, you mentioned that in passing, but I'm not sure everyone understands what that is. Maybe you might want to say something about that. It's a more holistic way of thinking about health, not just human health, but animal and how we all, planetary health in a way, which seems to be a promising way to think about this. So that's a whole bundle of questions really about science and its possibilities and limits. So can I come back to the three of you? Just pick and choose again, whatever strikes you as relevant there. But Aoife, since I picked on you there for that one point, maybe go back.
Yeah, or maybe Florian can start off with the details about the vaccine, which I think are very important and probably on people's mind. Then I can come back with the bigger picture.
Okay, Florian, please.
Yeah, sure. It's correct. The problem that we have with this virus is there are these two phases. There's a phase where the virus does a lot of damage, and then the immune system responds to that. And then the immune system does a lot of damage. And that's why we have different ways of treating people, right? Initially, antivirals or monoclonal antibodies are a good therapeutic because you want to get the virus load down. In the end, if somebody's already in very bad shape and on a respirator, that doesn't help anymore. And you try to suppress the immune system with dexamethasone, for example. Vaccines work in a very different way. They basically prevent you from getting to the stage where you are sick, so much earlier. Now, vaccines can work in many different ways. They can either block infection completely, and we have indication that in a proportion of people who get vaccinated, this is actually the case. And they can also help to basically, even if the virus takes hold in the respiratory tract, shut it down quickly. And that happens in another proportion of people who get vaccinated. So you never get to the stage where the virus even does damage. So you never get into those two stages. And yes, we can call them vaccines. Actually, many other vaccines work the same way. For example, influenza vaccines or the current pertussis vaccine don't necessarily prevent infection, they prevent disease. And so that's the case for a lot of vaccines. that's kind of how it works. But basically, the virus is stopped either from completely infecting you, that's true for a proportion of people, or from basically replicating so much that it does damage. Both ways are a good way to prevent you from getting sick. I'm just going to give it back to Eva about the epidemiology of the virus post-pandemic.
Right, and I want to pick up perhaps this One Health or planetary health, like you said, Dan. It's correct. It's a similar thought. And I just want to dwell a little bit on it, because I also think this is perhaps one of the most important takeaways from the pandemic once the dust settles eventually. Maybe want to go back to where did this virus come from? And one of the prevailing hypotheses to that end is that it's a zoonosis, so it most likely came from an animal, and there the bat is one of the most likely animals it may have come from originally, perhaps with an intermediate host until it came to us humans. But the bats are an example of where One Health would be important, because they have been quite often source animals for viral diseases, because there is this theory that bats have something peculiar. When they fly, they raise their body temperature quite high, even though they don't fly very often. But when they do, they have this high temperature, and any virus that's on them is going to evolve into a virus that can sustain high temperatures. So this makes the bat a very important animal in terms of zoonosis, because the viruses that come from a bat to us humans, even if through intermediate hosts, will not react as well to high temperatures, which is the typical human reaction to fight off diseases, which is to develop fever. So there's this prevailing theory that the bats, if you infringe on their habitat, for instance, by having a lot of urban developments and removing their natural ways of living, that they will be stressed. And if they are stressed, it will lead to more expression of these viruses and can ultimately lead for us to be infected. And it's one of the examples, and there are millions of them, where our interaction with the planet can ultimately lead to events like this pandemic or other more severe events. And so what we think about this is complexity science. The United States, again, is leading in that area. Arizona State University is currently establishing a school where there will be 1,000 persons trained every year in complexity science. And I think that is the way to move forward, to understand the complex connectivity of things on this planet in order to be able to prevent things like the pandemic to happen in the future. What we need is more training in that regard. Has also been one of my really, I would say, most enjoyable collaborations in the last couple of months with the Complexity Science Hub in Austria, where they also are looking at things from a more broad perspective and are trying to understand the connections between the various systems on this planet. So for me, I hope that this will be, again, perhaps the United States leading the way on how we need to train our future generations of scientists to be even more efficient in tackling these future challenges that we will face. And for the pandemic itself now, I think, well, I personally will rely on historical experiences. I understand, and Florian can probably chime in on that much better than I, that the expectation would be that SARS-CoV-2 eventually will weaken and not become a stronger and more dangerous virus. And if that's the case, then it will perhaps stay with us for a long time, but not be as much of a challenge as it currently is for us. And it may lead to our needing to update our vaccines, but will hopefully not impact our daily life as much anymore. But before I let Florian, because I myself am curious to hear his assessment, let him speak, I just also want to say we are in a different boat in Europe right now still, though. As much as I would love to talk about why don't everybody want to get a vaccine, etc., we are still struggling to get a vaccine, even for those who do want to have a vaccine. And there is, of course, a danger if you don't vaccinate quickly enough that new mutations can arise in a given population. And I do hope that this is not going to become a race against these perhaps future mutations. And so I'm anxious to get the vaccines going also in places like Europe. But maybe hand back to Florian.
Florian, you want to say something? I'll turn to Jeff after that, please.
Yeah, very briefly about so Eva is right. I think it might not be the virus that weakens, but we might get stronger. There's a lot of historic examples where viruses were introduced into the population, caused a pandemic, and then became seasonal viruses that are way less problematic because there's a lot of pre-existing immunity. Now, if everybody in the population has pre-existing immunity, you might get reinfected at some point in time, but this might be more like a common cold and not really a severe infection. And I think that's what's going to happen with SARS coronavirus too. It's likely that the prevalence is going to go down. It probably will acquire seasonality. And I don't think it's going to be a big problem in the future, but I also don't think it's going away. So I don't think we can eradicate it.
Jeff, on this whole bundle of scientific questions, you're on mute again. Sorry.
Just want to tease out from that the bundle of scientific questions, a strand that might be lost to the average viewer or person interested in this. And that is, science didn't start yesterday on this stuff or at the beginning of this year. There's been immense improvements in the health of the world's population due to public health activity mixed with vaccine development, amongst other things, over the past 100 years. So we have a particular challenge now that we've got to meet and go through, but our track record didn't start a year ago. Smallpox was eradicated. 300 million deaths probably have been saved due to that. And it was a scientific epidemiologic approach, a primitive by modern standards, but not to be sneered at for what it accomplished over time, whether it's measles, DTP, mumps. Childhood immunizations have been what I think is the major scientific advance period, comparable to the discovery of the wheel that mankind across the globe has benefited from. So yes, we're better at it, we're quicker at it, we can do things we couldn't do 100 years ago or 5 years ago, but let's not forget, we build this on a bedrock platform of science and accomplishment.
Thank you.
And could I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
We talk a lot about variants, and of course we see that countries take very different approaches to this disease. If we look at Brazil these days, you have a political leadership that pretty much neglects this issue, with a consequence that we see new variants coming from this country. How do we deal with something like that? Because Brazil seems to be like a laboratory for new variants. So what is our global approach to that? I mean, do we cut off all travel from and to Brazil? Or I mean, how do we deal with these very different and varied approaches from countries around the globe? Thank you.
Yeah,
Eva, please.
I think travel is one of the core issues also, and it has started the pandemic. If we had shut down all airports immediately, things would have looked differently. Whether that's feasible or not, it is a very important approach to inhibit travel, to slow down things. And I look at this with very much concern, honestly. And in part, this is why I said in Europe, we need to get vaccinated, because these variants can take a hold more quicker than you think if you don't stop travel. And apparently there is no political willingness to completely shut down travel. Even within borders in Europe, you have the discussion, can Bavarians travel to Tyrol and by car even, you know? It's not easy, I think, politically, but in theory, from a scientific standpoint, to prohibit these variants to spread across the globe that would be the most effective measure, and it will be important. The Brazilian variant, if let's say it comes to other continents to a degree that it can hold foot, that's not going to be good, I think, because the vaccines we already are learning are not going to be as effective. So it will slow down the progress that we're making. Not to say we can't fight that too, because then we will change the vaccines, but it will take time. And so I think you have a good point there.
We have a couple of questions, again, very specific on the issue at hand. If I could just ask maybe one of you to try to respond. There are two tests, apparently, an antigen test and a PCR test. And the audience member is saying, apparently, the antigen test is not as sensitive, but it's quicker, and it identifies infection better. It's better at identifying infectiousness better. And so shouldn't we think that we should do much more extensive antigen testing than is being done now? The second question is whether blood clots are a common result of a COVID-19 infection, and why, if so, why does this happen? And I have many other questions, but let me just, those are kind of factual questions. Let me just see if someone could just answer those, if that's, if someone feels they can.
I can say a few words to the tests, and then perhaps Florian to the blood clots or whoever else. For the testing, I mentioned that earlier too. I think that's a very good point as well. The major advantage of antigen tests, in my view, is that they're measuring the infectivity. It's a different thing. It's not the genome essentially of the virus, but it's a particle of the virus, which is only shed while a person will be infectious. So it has a narrow window, detects exactly what we need in order to prevent spread, which is when is a person infectious, and you have the results immediately, compared to PCR tests, which tend to still take over 24 hours to have a result. So I think that's the point that Michael Mina and Mark Lipsitch from Harvard School of Public Health were making, that you should use these rapid antigen tests much more. And in part, it is why the Austrians have adopted the strategy where they are testing school children now 3 times a week with these rapid antigen tests on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays to pick out the infectious children immediately. And the more broadly you can apply it, the more of an effect you will see. Michael Mina is estimating that you need to test at least 50% of the population once or twice a week in order to have an effect on and breaking waves. But it would be, if people adopt it, it would be a very good strategy.
And I can try to address the second question. So we know that SARS coronavirus 2 infections at a very high rate cause issues with blood clotting. I think the rate is about 10% in terms of thrombosis when you just get an infection, and about 30% in severe cases. It's not completely clear why that is. Of course, any type of inflammation can also influence coagulation, so blood clotting. We also know that the virus itself basically causes problems with endothelial cells, and that could contribute to that. We also know that the virus can bind to thrombocytes, which are, of course, involved in a major way in blood clotting. So there's many potential biological explanations for that, and a lot of them are investigated right now. But this was something that was seen very early on and has been recognized as a problem very early on.
Let me come to a different bundle of questions, and Jeff, maybe ask you first to comment. So the success of what has been done so far is sort of how advances in biology have been coupled with advances in digital technologies. The two have come together in an amazing way. But those digital technologies have also unleashed a whole wave of disinformation, misinformation about what's going on. The WHO calls it an infodemic. It's both domestic actors, but also foreign actors who target disinformation intentionally to disrupt and confuse. I wonder how we need to think about that. It relates to the public messaging again. If health authorities are trying to convince people to get these vaccines and vaccinations, what level of trust is there? It's a part of trust in government. And history has also shown us that you don't necessarily trust your government to do the right thing when it comes to vaccinations, at least in this country. There's also, at least in the United States, a question of equity and access, and I think also probably in Europe as well. So there's a whole bundle there. And we have a couple other questions which have to do with the international dimension of this. For instance, why wouldn't the US respond to the EU request to export AstraZeneca if it's not going to be used here? It's not been deemed safe here, but there is vaccine available. Why wouldn't the US do that is a question. This type of thing. And what about the Chinese and Russian vaccines? Are they safe? Russian citizens don't want to take the Russian vaccine, but the Russian government is sending it around the world. And China is yet to start really on vaccinating 1.7 billion people, and yet it's exporting things around the world. So there's a whole nother, what they call vaccine diplomacy issue going on here. And I just wonder, Jeff, I can turn to you first on any of those questions, whichever makes sense to you, and then to the others. Thank you.
I think that as a society and then individual countries, we need to reclaim the value of science, the value of vaccines and trusted sources for this. I think it can be done, but there is extensive and ongoing daily damage through misinformation and through very odd constructs that have been put into place, which you can find on websites. So the return of a respect for science, scientists, scientific approaches is really vital to dealing with both the current pandemic and future ones as they may spring up. Dan, as you said, there is some loss among some groups in what government does or can do. And when that's combined with a negative view and a distorted view of what science can do, then a double dose of damage is done to both the body politic, but also our ability to respond to threats from the population at large. So I think this is something that needs to be worked on, and it's a big issue. So whether it's in schools and what children learn in schools and how they think about science as a positive thing, whether it is an appreciation for science in other arenas, not just in the scientific one, but in other places. All that counts. And then an understanding of where science is limited in and of itself. We've touched on this a bit, but often in public health and in the types of crises we're dealing with, you don't have all the facts you'd like to have. Maybe you get them 6 months later, or a year later, or 5 years later, but you don't have them when you'd like to have them. So yes, science is vital, and we should do as much as we can with science, including doing proper vaccine efficacy studies with all vaccines, including those made in other countries. That part of the issue is basically making decisions under uncertainty. Rarely when you're in the midst of the public health crisis do you have every answer or every number or every understanding that you wish you had. So then you have to become adept at, here's the data and information we've got. It doesn't tell us everything, but we're going to have to make a decision, whether we like it or not, and try to make the best one under uncertainty. It's not a sure thing at that point. And you need a population that both understands that and is willing to support making progress in that area.
Thank you. So seeing we have only 4 minutes left, if I could turn to each the other two of you for just some brief final comments on that basket of questions. Maybe Florian first and then to Eva, if that's okay.
Yeah, just a comment about Chinese and Russian vaccines. I think specifically the Chinese regulators are pretty good. The vaccines, specifically the inactivated vaccines, have a history of being used. I think there are not really concerns about are they safe. There are phase 3 data that show that they're effective to, different effectiveness. Depending on where the trial was done, which vaccine was used. And I think also Sputnik 5 is in the end a good vaccine, and the idea to use 2 different viral vectors was clever. The problem was that the vaccine was declared safe and effective after a phase 2 trial in less than 80 individuals, which is, of course, a problem in terms of trust, right? Because if that is done, nobody believes any data anymore. And I think with the phase 3 data and applications in the EU for licensure and so on and so forth, the trust slowly comes back. But of course, this can be very damaging if you make these declarations without actually having the data or having any evidence that what you're saying is true. I think it's important to be transparent and have the data to back up what you're saying.
Thank you. Eva, last words.
Yeah, maybe I will close with an interesting observation I have made in myself even, which is it's so important to understand other cultures and other countries. And this works so well between Europe and the United States, but needs probably to be expanded to other parts of the world, like China or Russia and many other places, because I can tell you, if I know a culture, a scientific culture, and also the people who live in the country and their general ethics, I have much more trust in what is coming out of that country. So for me, I gravitate towards vaccines that are being developed either in Europe or the US for that reason, in part, because I know the data that are being used are going to be trustworthy, and the science that is underlying the data is solid. And I think if I had the same experience with other parts of the world, we would be much more of a global place. So I think it's going to be important that we learn to get to know each other also on that level. And what can I say? I hope that we will remain good friends in both places across the Atlantic, and that we will share perhaps vaccines if it's possible. But I don't think anything can ever divide us anyways. So I'm very optimistic about this great friendship between the 2 continents.
Thank you.
Well, that sounded like a big hooray for the importance of diplomacy. Thank you, Eva, for that.
That's right.
It is.
Yes. Good vaccine diplomacy. If I could, in the 30 seconds, just on this one issue, because it's a prominent issue right now across the Atlantic about the AstraZeneca. If the Food and Drug Administration doesn't approve a drug as safe, it would seem to me the US could not legally export what would be considered an unproven drug across the Atlantic. So I don't know that it's the US not trying, it's that there is a legal issue here. I don't know, Jeff, is that correct? Or could you just nod yes or no, or am I getting that wrong?
I'll nod, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, I think that must be because it's not been approved. So that's the difference between vaccines that have been approved. Anyway, we're going to leave it on at that note. This is a fascinating conversation that clearly goes on every day among scientists. Thank you all for allowing us a peek into the world that you're working on. It's been a pleasure to have you all there, and Ambassador Weiss and Robin, thank you for being with us, and the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation as our partner. We will continue this series, and stay tuned for more information on that. But thank you all. I hope our audience will join me in thanking. I would say when in the video world, if you want to thank people, instead of all the electronic stuff, you just go like this. So thank you to you, and we'll see you again. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.